that we're going to move rather swiftly onto our next panel, which is the state of play for Model UN and visions for the future. And for that, I'd like to invite our wonderful speakers up onto the stage. And I will give the microphone over to Chase.
Thank you so much. Really excited to moderate this panel. My name's Chase Mitchell. I'm originally from Wisconsin. I live in Maryland now. I'm the Senior Cost and Pricing Manager at Creative Associates International, which is a USAID implementing partner. And perhaps more importantly, definitely more importantly in this context, I'm also the Deputy Secretary General for NMUN New York. Very pleased to introduce a great panel here today, starting with Jorge Aranda. Mr. Aranda has been a Portuguese diplomat since 1998. He is currently the Deputy Permanent Representative of Portugal at the UN in New York. Previously, he was Security Policy Director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Lisbon. He has previously been posted in Copenhagen, Berlin, Warsaw, Helsinki, and NATO in Brussels. He was appointed diplomatic advisor to the Prime Minister, to the Secretary of State for European Affairs, and to the Secretary of State for National Defense in different Portuguese governments. Also joining us is Jayashri Wyatt, is the Chief of Education Outreach in the Outreach Division, Department of Global Communications. Jayashri is a seasoned communications professional with a wealth of experience in the United Nations system, producing high-level events, advocacy campaigns, and films for the Department of Global Communications, UNICEF, and the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Dr. Tina Zappile is an NMUN board member, NMUN, the conference that I'm the DSG for in just the next coming weeks here. Dr. Zappile is the chair and associate professor of political science at Stockton University and has led the campus-wide Model UN program at Stockton since its inception in 2012. She is also the lead author of Global Challenges, Promise and Peril in the 21st Century, and is the recipient of Stockton's 2016 Faculty of the Year Award. And finally, you've already met Bill Yotive, the WFUNA Model UN Coordinator. Mr. Yotive is currently the Model UN Coordinator for WFUNA. Prior to working at WFUNA, Mr. Yotive was project manager of the United Nations Global Teaching and Learning Project within the Outreach Division of the UN Department of Public Information for more than 14 years. He was responsible for creating educational materials for schools around the world on the United Nations and global issues on its agenda. In addition, he organized various global video conferences for students and teachers each year at the UN headquarters on human rights, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, and the observance of the International Day of Peace. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. And before we begin with opening remarks from the panelists here in the room, we also have a video from Jonas Bruns, the CEO of MyMUN. Jonas is the visionary of Okay, very well. We'll go right to the video.
Good morning and welcome to this World Model UN Day. I'm Jonas from the MyMUN team, running the world's largest MUN platform and database with now over 260,000 users and over 5,000 conferences. In this short video, let's discuss the state of play of MUN as a kickstart to today's debate. And I do so because through MyMUN we have a special perspective on MUN, a global perspective which is fueled by those over 260,000 users and over 5,000 conferences. Now, when we look at MyMUN, which is starting to become more and more reflective of the MUN community globally, yet still has many places around the world to reach, I see that we are growing tremendously. That's wonderful. We've received over 50,000 of those 260,000 user registrations in the last 12 months, over 1,600 of those 5,000 conference registrations in the last 12 months. Now, as we see this growth, this is not enough. We want every student around the world to participate in one MUN in their student life. And so we need all of you to grow MUN and linking it with the actual UN to give it the tailwind it needs and deserves. We see now that we're back after the pandemic, which has really had a tough toll on Model UN globally, and things like Resolution 77/336 are the right way forward. We've emailed our users countless times to chase their members of parliaments, to chase their politicians, and to demand implementation of said resolution. And it's a great way for young people to engage in politics for the first time. I'm very excited to follow your debate, to listen in and work with all of you to make MUN more accessible for everyone and make every student participate in one MUN in their student life. I thank you.
All right, and then I'll hand it over to Mr. Jorge Aranda for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Should I use this one?
Yes.
Is it on? Very good. Well, good morning, everybody. And I would like to start by obviously thanking the organizers, the winners across borders, and also the World Federation of UN Associations for the invitation and also for coming up with this innovative format, which allows us both here in the room as also online to kind of like amplify our voices. We are not just youth, but all of us, we are youth promoters, and it's good that our voices are amplified. I have been taking part at several Model UN events, both as a speaker and as a host. But today it's particularly important to be here because we see this discussion on the future of the Model UN nations also in light of this recent resolution we just passed, and we are excited about that. We are excited about making this come into fruition. Now, I'm preaching to already converted people, so I don't have to tell you how important we believe that the Model UN is in giving a contribution to developing skills of youth in terms of negotiation, but also in terms of awareness of what is done at the United Nations. As our host, thank you again, Chase, for the presentation already said, I am the Deputy Permanent Representative at the Portuguese Mission in the UN. Our ambassador is today accompanying our Prime Minister. He will be here during the day, and in the afternoon he will be handing over to the Secretary General to be exposed in the Delegates Lounge in the UN headquarters a piece of art, which is a donation. Every country has once in a while the opportunity of making such a donation. So she can't be here today, but we are very excited that the Prime Minister is here, and that we'll also have this token of the Portuguese commitment to be shown. Now, Portugal is also very happy and proud to be among Jamaica, whose ambassador we just listened to, and the Dominican Republic, and Egypt, and Laos. We are proud to have co-led the adoption of this resolution. And we would like to acknowledge also not just these countries I mentioned, but all the organizers of this event, and in particular, Bill, who has been from the beginning a staunch supporter of this endeavor. I am a diplomat, and I'm sure that among you there are also future diplomats. And I believe, as we all do in Portugal, that the Model UN can also be a very important tool to develop such skills which are always needed, not just in the UN, but in other multilateral organizations, but also in bilateral relationships. And we also saw, and I met briefly again, the special envoy for youth. Now, after the establishment of this office for youth at the UN, but also after the last iteration of the ongoing discussions on youth, which Portugal facilitates every year in the third committee of the General Assembly, we have realized that never before we had this resolution, and we should have one. Let me just point three things which we really attach importance to. One is, as I said, building capacity of young persons in international affairs. The second is the special attention that this resolution gives to encouraging member states and the UN staff, the civil society and other stakeholders to raise awareness on the importance of reinforcing multilateralism. And finally, the work that it welcomes, especially of the UN Secretariat's Department of Global Communications in that endeavor of raising awareness. Finally, And because the United Nations is not just a myriad of countries, it's also a myriad of cultures, of languages as well. We would like also to point to the fact that we, Portugal, have translated this guide to Portuguese. So it's not just for Portuguese citizens, it's for all the 250 million citizens around the world in 9 countries with the Portuguese as official language, but also to all others who speak Portuguese as well. And we would like to invite you to make use of this translation as well. And finally, a word on the Summit of the Future, which was also already spoken here of. It's one of the major highlights of the year. We will have in September, in the next UN General Assembly, we will have the Summit of the Future, and deriving from this summit, we will have a pact for the future. You, as a beacon of such future, have a word to say, should have a word to say, and we are delighted to hear that word that you have to say. Thank you once again.
All right, and now we'll hear opening remarks from Jayashri.
Great, thank you so much. And I also wish to thank the organizers. It is great to be here with all of you this morning. We're here to talk about the state of play for Model UN and the success stories between Model UN and the United Nations. And I think, first of all, I just want to tack on to my good colleague, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Mission of Portugal, and again, really take the opportunity to congratulate the mission on leading this successful negotiation with so many countries to make this resolution a reality. And just having that resolution really provides new groundwork and foundations for other countries who have maybe not been so involved to become more involved, and for those who have been involved to continue their engagement with Model UNs. I think in terms of the state of play, our role in DGC is 3 things. Our role is to inspire, it is to guide, and it is also thirdly to connect and engage with all of you as you are embarking on your role as global citizens around the world and engaging in global cooperation amongst yourselves in the work that you do in becoming a force for good. And when we are connecting, that third piece that I mentioned, we're connecting with the member states, working with them in their national contexts, taking the lead from them. We are the bureaucratic part of the United Nations. And what we do is we implement what the mission of the UN is as guided by the member states. We also work with amazing partners, NGOs such as WFUNA, that Bill is represented by, and of course, the MUNers from around the world, just to name a few. Just to come back a little bit to the state of play. I think we all know that we are living in incredibly challenging times, and I think that impacts Model UN as well. And Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, recently said in one of his addresses to the UN General Assembly that peace is the raison d'etre of the United Nations. This year is the 25th anniversary also of the culture of peace. And I think as we look around the world, this is something that the Secretary General also, really identified, is that as he scans around the world, he says that there is one thing that is missing, and that is peace. As we see the conflicts raging across the world in Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, Yemen, the trust deficit that was spoken about in the previous panel, the corrosive disinformation and hate speech, the problems around forging sustainable development and inclusive practices. It's peace that is the thread that really weaves through these, the world's common fabric. So I see, when I look out into the world and I see Model UN, operating. What I see is young people advocating, getting engaged in trying to bring about peace. You're trying to address these pressing problems that are facing all of us as a global community. And so on the inspire part that I mentioned of our work in the Department of Global Communications, nothing inspires us more than coming to events like this and seeing young people like yourselves just being at the table, getting involved, and making your voices heard, doing your research and engaging in a very, very practical way. So the other thing that I want to just talk about in terms of the guidance that we provide, of course, we do have an amazing website where we have resources in all of our 6 official languages. The Model UN Guidebook that the ambassador spoke about has also been produced in English and in French. Bill did a lot of work on that with us when he was with the Department of Global Communications. We have an email address where you can always reach us. We have an incredible resources page where we show you what are the priorities of the General Assembly for this year. We have all of the incredible summits that are upcoming. The ambassador also mentioned the Summit of the Future. The thing that I want to leave you with, my last thought for you, is that consensus is at the heart of multilateralism. And when we look around at all of the pressing challenges that we have, this is not a failure of multilateralism itself. It is not a failure of international cooperation per se. What it means is that the challenges that we face, the kinds of issues that human nature is engaged in, and when I say that, I mean conflict, the lack of willingness to come together to dialogue and to find durable solutions, they are more pernicious than we originally thought when the charter was created. So my call to action to you is, when you are negotiating and you're working on your Model UNs, remember that the UN is about inclusion. Right? This is a place where every single person should have a place of belonging. It is not a place where we can allow anyone to be an outsider. We cannot afford to leave anyone behind. So I urge you to be fiercely inclusive. The ambassador at the previous panel was talking about the fact that we have to have inclusion. So fight for inclusion. If people are missing at the table, ask yourself why, and do something about it to bring those young people to the table if they are not included. It is only through this kind of radical solidarity that we have with one another, which I call transformational solidarity, that we can really bring about the change in the world that we need. Thank you.
All right. And if you wouldn't mind passing down the microphone to Dr. Zappile.
Hi, thank you. As a board member of National Model UN, it's my pleasure to be here among so many supporters, former participants, and current leaders of Model UN everywhere. I want to start by reading the 2 first operative clauses in the 2023 Model UN resolution. Here, the General Assembly recognizes the important contribution of Model UN to diplomacy and international cooperation, and I bold here, building the capacities of young people in the field of international affairs, providing them with the knowledge and opportunities that they need. Second, the GA encourages member states to support Model UN, and I'm going to cut the middle, to increase, I emphasize, the capacity and opportunities for youth to meaningfully engage with the UN. In my short opening remarks, I want to focus on the capacities of young people, 1, and 2, the opportunities for youth to engage, as the two reasons why Model UN has endured over the last 70 years, 90 years, depending on when you mark the very first MUN. In terms of capacity, Model UN at its best allows students to fail in a space where the stakes are less important. You might be thinking, wait, what? Fail? Hear me out. The opportunity to build skills and practice and fail before they succeed does not exist in most spaces for young people today. The stakes are usually too high. And we all know failure is a part of building resilience. There is no other way. And if there is anything that requires resilience, hard work, and patience, it is governance and diplomacy, especially at the global level. Working in public service and governance is difficult, and often the best solutions disappear right in front of our eyes. Failure is a central feature of governance. It takes grit and determination to work for months, years, or even decades to get one thing passed through a UN committee or a local township council, a government agency at the federal level, or a parliament. And we learn through Model UN that it's worth the time and energy and the repeated failures to get to our achieved goals. I also want to acknowledge the resolution's emphasis on opportunity. My first Model UN experience was as an undergraduate in the year 2000 at the Far West Model UN in San Francisco, California. What is unique about my story to some is not unique at all for many other students. I had just returned to school after a 4-year hiatus, after a host of circumstances, personal choices, and other challenges. Working against my favor simply became too much and led me to dropping out in the middle of my junior year of college. I worked up to 3 service industry jobs at a time for the next few years, not really knowing what I was going to do, eventually earning enough money and receiving enough state and federal aid to return. And guess what experience opened my eyes to a career in studying international relations and now being here with all of you? Yes, it was that Far West Model UN experience in San Francisco. Prior to that, and for many students in my country, in the US, and around the rest of the world, our career aspirations are somewhat limited to where we live, the city, the rural area, the mountainous region, wherever that may be. While I was already drawn to government and politics, I had no idea of the opportunities available to me, and Model UN gave me the chance to see that the types of problems and issues people working on in the rest of the world were not so different than those in my local community. At the time, in rural Nevada, this was about storage for nuclear power, a topic for Model UN often, yes. So this is why these 2 reasons, opportunities for failure, but really engaging young people in providing them chances to network with others, to see that the issues that others care about, again, are not so different than in their own local communities, but building that capacity. That's the promise of Model UN, and that's why it has endured, again, over these last 70 to 80 years. I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
All right, and last but not least, Bill Yotive.
Thank you very much. State of play. Thinking about that, the thing that comes to mind is, where are we today in the world of Model UN? And in order to understand the state of play, as I said in my opening remarks, I wanted to focus today on where we are and where we're going. But in order to understand where we are, I think we need to take a little bit of a historical journey in terms of how we got to where we are today. How did the state of play of Model UN, what is the state of play today, and how did we get here? I'm currently writing a book on the history of Model UN, which hasn't been written, so all of this history is kind of floating around in my head. But I'd like to start out in the, as you know, the first Model UN was in 1943, 2 years before the UN was created. After that first Model UN, there were another 3 Model UNs before the UN actually came into existence in 1945. Once the UN came into existence, obviously the simulations started to reflect the actual structure of the UN. Initially, the simulations focused exclusively on the General Assembly. The first deviation from that I found in 1948 at Syracuse University, which has a very important place in the history of Model UN. They were the first ones to simulate the Security Council. Fast forward to my first Model UN. This is from my first Model UN in 1970. I still have the book. When we, in 1970, were simulating the UN, we did mostly General Assembly committees. We did 1 Security Council simulation, and we had 1 simulation on ECOSOC. ECOSOC was not simulated very much at all in the early history of Model UN. Today, we have all kinds of simulations. The UN system is very large. Initially, we grew from the General Assembly. 1948, we added the Security Council. Somewhere along the line, we added ECOSOC, and now today, it's full-blown across the UN system. I want to read a little bit from an article talking about how Model UN has evolved from that early history. There was an article that was published in the New York Times in 2013 called "The Dog Eat Dog World of Model UN." If you have not read this article, I urge you to go back and search it on Google. 2013, "The Dog Eat World of Model UN." And I want to read a little bit from that article. It was the era of the prohibition. The crime bosses had convened an emergency summit in Atlantic City. Violent bootleg wars in Chicago and New York were threatening their businesses. "Gentlemen, take down Al Capone? Have you lost your minds?" asked an exasperated Bugsy Siegel. "We need to let whatever's happening in Chicago happen in Chicago and work on stabilizing New York and making sure that our supply lines are also stable." A student from the University of Pennsylvania tapped her gavel to let Bugsy know his speaking time had elapsed before recognizing the gambling kingpin Meyer Lansky. The rest of the students, representing gangsters, not delegates, sneered and ridiculed one another, jostling for supremacy over America's illicit trade. Meanwhile, in nearby meeting rooms, 1,200 students and other small committees recreated scenes from the Civil War, a Pakistani cabinet, and the cult series The Wire. This is not FDR's Model United Nations, that rigid simulation of General Assembly protocol and decorum. Conferences like this one in Philadelphia, hosted by the club at Penn, have turned MUN, as it's called, into a full-fledged sport, with all the competitiveness and rowdiness that it suggests. Today, there are official sponsors and rankings of schools and so forth, but you get the idea. Back in 2013, it's already noting that in Model UN, these crises simulations have become an important part of Model UN. I remember at Yale, they did as a part of a Model UN conference, they did a simulation of Dante's Inferno in the context of a Model UN conference. This is how Model UN has evolved from the early days. Although we call things a Model UN conference, it has become a term to be synonymous with just simulating almost anything. And so these simulations are now a part of Model UN conferences all around the world, these crisis simulations. This is where we have gone. This is what students find exciting about going to, perhaps you have participated in some of these crises and you understand what I mean. They're very exciting. So let's talk a little bit about how Model UN has evolved. This is a little bit about that story and how it has not evolved. As you know, Model UN was not created by the UN. It was started before the UN was even created. It was an NGO-led movement to engage young people in supporting this new institution, which became called the United Nations. From the very beginning, Model UN used and still uses today what are called parliamentary rules of procedure. You're all familiar with those rules. Those rules are not used at the United Nations. all the points and motions that you are used to using in Model United Nations, except for one, is not used at the United Nations. The only point that is similar in Model UN and the UN is a point of order. There's no yielding of time. There's no seconding of motions. There's no moderated and unmoderated caucuses. Even the terms that are used for the General Assembly committees are not used at the United Nations. Dissect, SOCOM, all of that, not used at the United Nations. The UN is not a parliament. And some of these rules actually violate the principle of sovereign equality that the UN was founded upon. Having signatories on a resolution violates the principle of sovereign equality. Every member state is a sovereign nation. They don't need another country giving them permission to submit a resolution to be considered. These things continue to be used in Model UN today. All of the decisions in Model UN are made by voting. The UN started moving away from voting in the 1950s. In the 1950s, they started. In 1971, they adopted a resolution encouraging member states moving forward to adopt all their resolutions by consensus that Jayashri mentioned. And in the 1974-75 session of the General Assembly, it was the first time in the history of the United Nations that the majority of resolutions adopted in the General Assembly were adopted without a vote. And that trend only increased from 1974-75 until today. It peaked in 2015. Imagine this, 90% of the resolutions adopted in the General Assembly were adopted without a vote. That is what consensus means. Consensus means it's a negotiation process that starts with the aim of reaching agreement on the text of an outcome document, whatever type of outcome document it is, so that at the end of the negotiation process, there is no need to vote. It is an inclusive, collaborative process. It is different than the negotiation process when you make decisions by voting. Voting does not promote consensus, and the UN values it. In fact, the consensus approach is now adopted throughout the UN system. In ECOSOC, most parts of ECOSOC, if a resolution or another outcome, they have different kinds of outcome documents. It could be agreed conclusions in the Commission on the Status of Women. If consensus is not reached on the text, that text is withdrawn. There is no voting. Other parts, you take the CCPCJ, one of the functional commissions, it has never voted in its history. There are all of the entities based in Vienna. We call it the spirit of Vienna. They take great pride in the fact that they adopt their outcome documents without voting. So Model UN has not evolved. Most students, I find, are not even aware of this consensus approach or how the negotiation process works to reach consensus. So these are ways that the Model UN, so I gave you some examples of how Model UN has evolved towards these, including these crises committees, and ways it has not evolved. It continues using practices that are used in parliaments and making decisions that the UN has moved away from. So some of the things that I found in my research that are interesting to consider are things that used to occur in simulations that have been lost in history. One of the things that was very noticeable when you're researching Model UN is the number of newspapers around the world that wrote articles on these simulations when they took place. It doesn't occur as much as it used to. It used to be a standard practice that newspapers would cover Model UNs and report on them. This has to do a lot, I think, with how the public is aware of what is going on. You understand, people that participate in the Model UN community are aware of what's going on, but people outside of that, they're not even aware, perhaps, that even Model UN exists. And a part of that is that it's not being covered in media anymore the way it used to. The other thing that I found that was interesting in the early history of Model UN is they used to have these debriefing sessions where they would have, sometimes it was diplomats, sometimes it was somebody from the UN who would come and observe these conferences. And at the end of these conferences, they would sit down with the students and debrief with them and give them their feedback on what they observed. That doesn't really occur. And this could be something that's really valuable educationally for students, to have this kind of feedback from real experts. So these are things that I found also that used to exist, that don't exist anymore, that perhaps we should consider how to include them in our simulations moving forward. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of the history of it and address the two issues of how Model UN has evolved and how it has not evolved, and hopefully that will enter into our discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank all of you so much. I'm going to be taking questions from the room in just a minute. I'll start us off with one. So if you have a question, lock it away, and we'll come back to you momentarily. There's a lot of recurring themes through all of your comments. Dr. Zappile, you talked about Model UN causing people to open up, explore new careers. I know that's certainly true in my case. And yet, it seems that there is often a struggle translating what students engage with in Model UN and getting them to engage with the actual UN. I remember at a closing ceremony at NMUN once, there was a youth representative who came up and asked, how many of you have signed up for this initiative? And there was like a single-digit number of hands in a room of over 1,000, which is quite depressing to me. So I'm curious if there's any success stories, thoughts on how we can improve engagement in that direction. And coming from the other direction, I think there is a lot of youth cynicism about youth engagement. Especially there's a feeling that when youth are engaged, their voices may be heard, but they are often not acted upon. And I'm wondering, coming from the other direction, how we can improve actual or hear success stories, if you have any, of meaningful youth engagement. So I'll open it up for any of you to answer, and I'm happy to hand this microphone if we don't want to pass it all the way down too.
I could start with some success stories that I've observed. And this gets to the issue that has been brought up by earlier speakers about the importance of accessibility. I think one of the things that we need to address moving forward in Model UN is to make Model UN more accessible to students around the world. Part of the barriers, financial barriers, which prevent many students that don't have the ability to afford the costs and fees that are associated, and that results in a situation where we get a self-selected group of students that can afford to participate in these conferences, and other students that would like to but cannot. During the pandemic, one of the good things about the pandemic is that it opened up Model UN to a wider community, because everything moved online, and we found a lot more students able to access participation in Model UN in the way that they hadn't before. So one of the success stories that I saw was a program in South Africa that I thought was really exemplary. They come up with this idea of twinning schools, where they would twin a school that was more well-to-do with a school that was from a poor area of South Africa. And they would create Model UN delegations where half of the delegation was composed of students from well-to-do schools and half of the delegation was composed of students from poor schools. And then these delegations were then subsidized and traveled to other countries. And they did an amazing job. You wouldn't be able to tell during the performance, their performance in a conference, which schools these students came from. And the idea of making this twinning allowed students from different economic backgrounds to participate was, for me, a great success story. I've seen some replications of this, a little bit of it, but this is something that I think that we need to find ways to do more of. And this is one way, one success story that I found that can help make Model UN more accessible.
I'll share a couple of examples. I am a chair of a political science department at a state public university, a regional university. We do serve the population that I do think should be at the table at more Model UN simulations, not just, again, in my country, but elsewhere too. But I do think a lot of the successes may not be as obvious. So I wrote down 3 examples. One graduate, for example, is currently enrolled in CUNY Law School on human rights. And I think her passion for human rights, would it have been there had she not participated in Model UN? Maybe, but not to the extent. And her experience, I think, helped her get into a law school she otherwise might have been overlooked at in the admissions process. Another student I have works for Amnesty International, and just all the stories I was trying to think of as you asked the question, they're sort of tangentially related to the broader UN system or work alongside people in the UN or in member states. So the successes may not be as narrowly defined as we might think. I think if we expand our idea of what that success looks like, we might find more of those stories.
Thank you. I certainly take your point about the cynicism of young people. I think there's a sense right now that, you know, all of these problems which were created by generations, my generation and generations above me, and that, you know, sometimes there's almost a placing of responsibility on young people to solve the problems of the previous generations. And I feel like some of that cynicism comes from what can the generations who cause those problems also do about them? And I think part of the answer to this question is really understanding the nature of power itself. Because we live in a world that is structured by the powerful. There are economic forces that create those power structures. There are the historical forces of colonization and some of the systems that still exist, like racism, unwritten rules that affect our daily lives, misogyny that still exists as well. And that's why, you know, my point of view is transformational solidarity and trying to find people that you might not normally engage with and make it your business to do that. So on a very practical level, I do think what the ambassador of Jamaica was talking about in terms of advocacy is, you know, we also have to find who are the allies that we can work with, who can help to change the nature of power so that real solutions can come to the fore. So I just want to say, and I'm sure my good colleague from the Mission of Portugal, you know, there are a group of member states who are open to the young people in their own countries having a place in their governance systems. And they are bringing their youth representatives to the UNGA. So there are countries that are very invested in this. And so I think the kind of advocacy that young people need to engage in, part of the strategy I would encourage you to think about is finding those countries' member states, organizations who are receptive to this. Because the more we create momentum, the more we're able to bring along other places, parts of the world, and issues that need to be transformed as well. So I think that's part of the answer that I see to how we can really meaningfully engage with young people. Just a point that I want to raise with you as well is that in the United Nations, again, I mentioned we are the Department of Global Communications. We're the bureaucratic part of the UN. And we implement what the member states resolve that we need to do. But the United Nations Information Centers, which exist outside of New York in what we still call field offices. There are amazing United Nations colleagues working there. Their names and contacts and offices are listed on the internet. So if you're in another country and you want to reach out to UN personnel, it is completely wide open. And I just want to say that one example of great work that's happening from one of our eunuchs is the eunuch in India. And, there are over 90 Model UNs that happen a year that they are specifically involved with. So just know that this is another resource within the UN system that you have access to, free access to. You can literally just pick up the phone and call the number to their, offices. So I encourage you to, pick up the phone and do that. We're here and our job is to support, guide, inspire, and connect with you, as I said. Thank you.
Very shortly, and to touch upon a concept which has not been addressed here today, which is ageism. Ageism is a form of discrimination as many others. And sometimes youth is regarded within this this sphere of ageism, as if a young person would be a half-baked person. But it also applies to older people, as older people would be also out of models already. So in public policy, we also have to understand that discrimination can also apply to age, and we have to do whatever we can to avoid falling into that trap. Both at internal level in Portugal and also in our work here at the Portuguese mission at the UN, we are striving to, whatever the position we are taking, that it also takes into account the importance of non-discrimination upon age. Now, one of the things, it's obviously easier said than done, and while negotiating resolutions and decisions, you always have to make sure to mainstream that youth aspect, and I'm talking about youth, but I can also talk about older persons, into whatever we are deciding. And we as policymakers, and you as policy shapers, we have to understand that whatever we are negotiating has an impact in the future. And that means that you will also grow out of the current state of youth, right? So you are also invited to already position yourselves into the future. I would like to also draw your attention to some of the aspects that the United Nations we are already touching upon. It's not just the youth office that we already spoke about. It's also what we call the future generations. Future generations is part of our discussion on the Summit of the Future, and it means that our policy has to also take into account people that have not yet been born. So when developing policies, we have to look not only for you, who are not yet at the driver's seat, but also to people that do not yet exist. So we have to project ourselves. Now, the current Secretary General has invested a lot on scanning the horizon and understanding what the challenges of the future may be, like not in 10 years, but also in 30 years, in 50 years. And this is kind of like the world you're living in. We expect you, as innovative persons that you are, to also bring your ideas into it. We hear the cynicism question, but while there is a time and a place for policy making, and in our case for decision making at the UN, where states are represented, there's also a time for decision shaping, and that's your time, that's your space. Organize yourselves, structure yourselves, gather yourselves around your special youth envoys, and make yourself heard.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, just quickly, the ambassador's remarks just jogged my memory about something I wanted to mention. We talk about the state of play, where Model UN is going. And of course, we associate Model UN and youth because that's where, who's participating in it. But the future of Model UN is also moving towards cross-generational simulations, where we have youth participating with people that are older in these simulations. And a new thing which is happening on a small scale, but it's starting to happen, is having simulations for people that are in the professional world now. They're older, they've maybe done Model UN, or they haven't done Model UN, but this is also a way for them to learn about the United Nations and how it functions And I just wanted to mention that this is also a direction that the UN is going in, not the UN, Model UN is going in terms of expanding Model UN beyond just a youth audience and having cross-generational simulations and also simulations addressed to people that are older.
All right. Very dynamic discussion. Thank you all for the comments. We do want to sneak in a few questions. So who out there in the audience?
I also want to know we have a few questions online. I will read out a couple, but we'll take a few here. So start.
Thank you all for your great talks. It was really great to listen to you all. My question is about accessibility in Model UN. As a college student myself, and as someone who provides Model UN experiences for people who are new to college and people who are making their way through college, accessibility is always at the front of my mind. Finding ways to make Model UN fiscally and practically responsible for people who are, this is their first time that they're in college, the first time that they're away from their families, and who have never participated in any formal form of debate. The deputy representative was talking about translating Model UN manuals into Portuguese to break that language accessibility barrier. And Mr. Yotive was talking about ways to make, or the problem of making Model UN fiscally fit, or different students be able to do Model UN because of the fiscal barriers of traveling and of staying in one place for a weekend and of competing. So my question is, on who does the responsibility of making Model UN conferences accessible fall on? Does it fall on the students? Does it fall on third-party Model UN organizations? Does it fall on universities, or does it fall on UN youth offices? And the second part of my question is, how does the UN help these Model UN organizations make Model UN more accessible fiscally and practically? How can Model UN better support these organizations who most of the time are searching for these resources themselves, more accessible to students all around the world who have never even heard of what Model UN is?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we've got a few questions. Well, we'll take, in fact, I think most of the questions here, so we're only a bit out of time. So there are notepads if you need to write them down ahead. But the other questions, I saw the gentleman here. Is there a question? Yeah. And then we'll go to yourself.
Okay, so I heard quite a common thread between what Ms. Wyatt and Mr. Yotive have mentioned, this idea of radical inclusion, and you mentioned the UN's progression towards adopting resolution by consensus. Now, we all agree here that Model UN has value as an educational vehicle for leaders of the future and for youth leaders. So I suppose my question is, we see that by and large in most organizations where Model UN is conducted, we are actually not simulating a fully inclusive and consensus-based model. So the question is, how can we work, for instance, through WFUNA and through MUN Across Borders with the historic international MUN organizations, the Harvard, the NMUNs, the THIMUNs, all the way down to the smaller ones at the regional and local level, to start incorporating the way that that radical inclusion and the more consensus-based model, because that's not the way we're doing it, by and large.
Thank you. Was over here.
Thank you for the amazing speech. My question actually started for the first questions about accessibility and financial costs. I'm president of Model UN Club at my college, and I face every single semester we struggling, requesting for funding for participating in conference. We are gonna go actually Mount Far West this April coming, and every semester they are trying to cut our costs, and we need to cut in meals, in number of members participating. And I really would like to ask you guys, what can you do? What can you do for the colleges, the universities understand the necessity for they have a Model UN club? Thank you.
I think that's all the time we have, and we've had a lot of questions come online, about 20 or 30. I'm not going to ask 20 or 30. I'm just going to ask maybe two of them that we had the most interest in. One is regarding the UN. The real negotiation process is long, and of course builds on decades, if not sometimes centuries of relationships between countries, compared to Model UN, which is a lot shorter. So how do we strike a balance between accuracy and practicality between Model UN? And there was one specific one, which is an interesting comment, maybe more to Tina and Bill Yotive, which is on the commercialization of Model UN, which has happened a bit more. Where do we draw the line between non-profit organizations, colleges organizing conferences, and what is some big organizations are essentially making quite a lot of money out of this? Now, I want to encourage all those who have hands up. We are going to a break afterwards. which hopefully the sooner the panel and the questions, we can go to the break sooner, so you can ask your questions there as well. But I think that's all for that. So thank you very much.
All right, I'll kick it to whoever wants to start.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want to?
No.
Hi, so I can speak to a couple of the questions, but the one about accessibility is really critical. Again, from the institution that I represent, but also as a board member of NMUN, which is a registered nonprofit. I'll share that as a provider of conferences, we do have a mechanism for scholarship support for schools largely coming from outside of the United States, particularly in countries that don't support or in countries or at schools that don't support that particular delegation. And as a board, we're informally talking about how we could expand those scholarship opportunities to include schools that in general don't have access. And we know who those schools are, generally public schools, not that all students at private schools have the means to attend, to be clear. There's a lot of variance in the ability to self-pay across all institutions, but I think it's a shared responsibility. There is a responsibility of providers, I think, to make some opportunities available, whatever fits your mission, whether that's public institutions from a particular region in the world, what have you. And honestly, connections are the way to build those types of opportunities and to learn about where the needs are in your particular conference. And I'll say with the funding, I know that with the resolution, I'm sure hopeful, and I'm sure many people around the world are as well, that resolution provides an opportunity for those involved in Model UN to make demands of your member states and NGOs to sponsor your schools, your delegations, to travel to Model UN conferences. You certainly have the justification for it in a way that you have not before prior to that UN resolution. So I think that's a really important impact, but that requires people to use that resolution for that purpose. And I think some member states do a decent job of that already, but I would encourage you to make more demands. They conceded, or they agreed, not voted on the resolution, but their name's on it. That's one way that they can deliver on the promise of that resolution.
I can just add to that. I mean, these questions are very, they're practical and they have a huge impact. It's always interesting to me to understand how much money plays a role in being able to make things like this happen. It's such a practical consideration. So what I will say on the part of the UN and the Department of Global Communications, the resolution that came from our member states is to continue doing what we do within existing resources. So we obviously do not have a pot of money that we can throw at this. But what we can do, I think, is, I agree with my colleague here that this is a shared responsibility. And I think that governments can play a role in this and can help to unlock funds. I think NGOs, how incredible is it, the work that NGOs do to support the work of Model UN? So I just really, give it up for the NGOs who see the value in this and continue to do that work. It's so important and so powerful. And I also commend the member states that are unlocking funds for young people. I think universities is another really interesting place that we can really lean into. One of the other things in my portfolio is the United Nations Academic Impact. So this is something, it's 1,600 universities in over 150 countries. They align to the values and principles of the UN. What better way to align to the UN than through Model UN? So what I can commit to, like here and now, is to talking to those universities in our membership about what is their level of support, and can we ask them to think about doing more and adding more oomph to that. So I'll leave it there because I know we're short on time and I want to pass to my colleague.
Thank you very much. And in order to forge the consensus on which we should operate at the UN, I would like also to align with this idea that it is a shared responsibility. And speaking for my country, obviously we do have a share of responsibility too, and we are very aware of that. And this is why we have been increasing systematically and significantly our budget for youth, and also here at the UN with national voluntary contributions, including recently for the recently created UN Youth Envoy Office. Now, this is one thing, but it's also we have also finance is obviously an important thing. Another one is advocacy, and this is what we are doing here. This is also what we try to do with the resolution, and the resolution as such, and if we implement it rightly, is enough soft legislation for us then at our national level also to make things go. And the other thing is in practical terms, like the operational support that we can give. In Portugal, we are now considering to develop a training program for potential UN model promoters. And this training program should be one to develop those skills of potential future UN model organizers, but also a kind of an alumni forum where we can exchange good practices. Finally, and because this is a shared responsibility, we are making noise here at the UN. You should make noise yourselves too.
Yeah, I want to echo everything that's been said, but also add, I think we need to have more press. I think every time you have a conference, you need to try to get it covered in the press. It makes, if you have something that you have in the media that you could take to a potential funder, that makes a lot more difference than you just going to them and speaking without anything that's been publicly printed about it. So I think we need to see more press, and I think we need to use this press to go to funders and seek more funding. The twinning concept that I talked to you about is also something that I think we need to expand. We're working now with the World Health Organization. Every year we're going to be organizing simulations of the World Health Assembly at their headquarters in Geneva. They also, accessibility is very important. The Director General of WHO made it known to us that this conference, when we organize it, must be accessible to as many people around the world as possible. And a part of that, what we've talked about, is how can we use this twinning concept to make this accessible. So this is something that I think we need to expand more about. To address the questions about making this more inclusive, collaborative process, from my experience, organizers really have to want it. It's not something that you can impose upon them. There are people that prefer, they've been doing Model UN for years. They don't want to change. They want to keep things the way they are. So an organizer has to want to do that. We organize conferences around the world. I've been working on this for 15 years. It's completely paced. I teach students about the consensus approach, the negotiation process that goes along with it, which is very different from the negotiation process when you're voting. And we spend a lot of time training students about how to negotiate with the aim of reaching consensus in many, many different simulations that we do. So you're welcome to participate in our conferences, and then you see, we find a lot of times when people participate in our conferences, you know, a part of the feedback is, I can't go back to doing this the way I've been doing it. What else did I want to say? The what? Let me get to that for a second. There was another question here. Oh yes, the matching the practicality of the negotiation process is longer than voting. One of the nice things about voting is you could just put things to a vote and it's decided by a simple majority, or it's not, and you move on. One of the things that we've done, and I've been working on this for 15 years, it is possible to balance a longer negotiation process. One of the things that we do is we only focus on one outcome document. Many simulations, you have multiple outcome documents per agenda item or per simulation that you're doing. We focus exclusively during a simulation on one outcome document. That makes it possible to have this longer negotiation process than you find in traditional Model UNs. Commercialization, I don't know if somebody else wants to speak to that, but.
We have maybe just about 1 minute yet left. So any quick comment on that? it's a tough one. I'll add on, just if you're trying to think, how can we align your Model UN, if you're an organizer, to the actual UN, it might be worth examining your rules of procedure. At NMUN, we made a minor adjustment to our application where we presume that every resolution is going to be adopted by consensus unless a vote is requested, and you'd be astonished what a minor change like that can do in terms of perception. Can you join me in giving one last thank you and round of applause to our panel participants?